Hi, Jessica Nadav, bringing you this week's Torah for Parashat Miketz. By the way, if you like these videos, please like, share, subscribe, comment. So in this week's parasha, we read of Paro's two dreams. Rabbi Professor Yonatan Grossman says that these dreams are told to Yosef, who here encounters a third example of what seems to be a set structure and formulas for dreams. That is, that they come in pairs. Yosef's two own dreams, the sheaves of corn and those of the stars, remember? The two dreams in prison, that of the baker and of the butler, those are two as well. And Paro's two dreams, the 7 cows and the 7 sheaves. Only now in this week's parasha do we discover a vital piece of information. Until now we may have thought that Yosef was a spoilt young man with delusions of grandeur. But now Yosef says to Paro, who has also had two dreams, quote, "The reason the dream was given to Paro in two forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon." Only in retrospect do we realize that Yosef's double dream is a sign that he really was destined to be a leader who his family would bow down to. Paro's dream in this week's parasha, or should I say Paro's dreams, they're referred to both as one dream and two dreams. So Paro's dreams in this week's parasha are made even more interesting because of the drama which surrounds them. Yosef, the Hebrew criminal slave, is quickly brought before Paro after Paro's most skilled magicians fail to provide a satisfactory interpretation of the dreams. The challenge now passes to Yosef, a Hebrew criminal slave incarcerated in Egyptian jail. The question is, why did Paro accept Yosef's interpretation over those of his elite professional magicians? Let's hold that question for a minute and let's add another question to that. After Yosef explains to Paro the meaning of the dreams, namely that there will be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine in Egypt, which will make people forget the years of plenty, he goes on to suggest how to deal with the oncoming famine. He tells him to appoint, quote, "a wise and clever person and place him in charge of the land of Egypt. Paro should appoint officials over the land and set aside a fifth of a portion of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of plenty, and that will be a surety for the land for the 7 years of famine which come upon the land of Egypt," etc. Whilst a good and practical suggestion, it's hugely surprising. Why? Well, imagine the scene. Yosef has just been hauled up from jail, smartened up for Paro, who has just offered up an interpretation of his dreams. Then before Paro even responds and says that he'll accept Yosef's interpretation, Yosef goes on to suggest a practical solution for the whole Egyptian economy. How can Yosef be so certain that Paro will accept his interpretation and not reject it outright, as he had the suggestion of the magicians? Paro saw himself as a descendant of the gods, as we can see in Yechezkel, and the dream itself, it emphasizes the river Nile, which symbolizes the Egyptian economy and which also apparently embodies a religious presence. See how many mentions of the river are from the outset. And Paro dreamed, and behold, he was standing by the river. That's the first one. And behold, from the river rose 7 cows, and behold, 7 more cows after them from the river, and they stood next to the cows on the banks of the river. That's 4 separate mentions of the river in 3 short pesukim. The emphasis on the location of the dream immediately connects this dream with Egypt's power. Paro, who considers himself a demigod, dreams of the river, which itself is considered a god. In the encounter between Yosef and Paro in this context, the Torah brings an almost unimaginable contrast. We have Yosef, who is lower than anyone else in the whole of Egypt, a foreign slave who is also a criminal, meets with Paro, who considers himself a demigod, who has dreamed about the very heart of Egyptian power. So one can imagine Yosef's nervousness, if not utter terror, and the total disdain of Paro and his magicians, and yet this nobody slave dares to make political and economic suggestions to the king about the whole of Egypt. Suggestions which he's not asked to make, by the way, and which way overstep his remit as interpreter of dreams, which is a very limited remit. Surely Paro is going to ignore him and immediately haul him back to jail, right? But that's not what happens. Despite Yosef's audacity, Paro not only accepts what he says, but he goes as far as to praise him, saying, Is there to be found a person in whom the divine spirit rests? Thus it is reasonable to assume that Paro must have accepted interpretations and explanations offered by his magicians. Would he ever have considered them people in whom the divine spirit rests? Would he then have made them second in command in Egypt? But in this particular case, the magicians were unable to interpret his dreams. Certainly not to his satisfaction. In what way then is Yosef's solution different from any interpretation given by any other of the magicians? So the two problems we have raised, Paro's conviction that Yosef's interpretation is correct, and Yosef's seeming impertinent proposal, and Paro's enthusiasm at this proposal, are interconnected. Those two questions are interconnected. The dreams disturbed Paro greatly, we know, and he felt that something significant was being hinted at, but he couldn't quite understand what was going on. He couldn't decode the meaning of the hint of the dream, nor the significance of it. And he wanted to be sure of the correct interpretation. He wanted some comfort in knowing, because he was so disturbed, he needed some comfort knowing that the interpretation was the correct one. So how does he go about this? The Torah itself emphasizes the method which Paro used. Now we know, of course, that the Torah does not waste any words. Every word is relevant. So here the Torah repeats the details of the dream, almost word for word, when Paro relates it to Yosef. Why would the Torah do that? Why wouldn't it simply write, and he told him of the dreams he had? Full stop. That would have been enough. When the Torah repeats something at length, we need to analyze the repetition very carefully, because the fact that it's been repeated itself plays an important role in the story. So here the Torah repeats the dream, because that is precisely the tactic which Paro chooses to test his magicians. A comparison of the dreams, as related by Paro, with the description that he then gives Yosef, will reveal two differences. In the original description of the dream, we read, and I quote, "And behold, from the river arose 7 cows, and behold, 7 other cows arose after them, and stood next to the cows on the riverbank." Those are important words. In Paro's description of the dream, the last part is missed out. The bit about the other cows standing next to the cows. He makes no mention of the cows standing side by side before the lean cows consume the fat cows. Paro omits this, but he invents another detail. In the original description we read, again I quote, "And the bad-looking lean cows consumed the 7 good-looking healthy cows, and Paro woke up." When Paro recounts the dream to Yosef, that's not what he says. He says, I quote again, "And the lean and bad cows consumed the first healthy cows, and when they were inside them, it could not be known that they had been consumed, for their appearance was as bad as it had been at first, and I woke up." He adds this whole new detail, and it's difficult to ignore this significant addition. And the Torah repeats it twice for emphasis. "And it could not be known that they had been consumed, for their appearance was as bad as it had been at first." By the way, incidentally, just remember this, because in a few weeks' time, when we get to Parashat Vayera, I'll try and remember to tell you a brilliant observation by my American Chavrut Liba when it comes to Aaron's staff eating the staff of Paro. We'll get to that then. So let's go back to this. The changes in Paro's narrative, which he used, they were secret to Paro, and he used it so he could see who could correctly interpret his dreams. Paro understood very deeply that these were not regular dreams, but rather a divine message, and that caused his spirit to be very troubled. The genuine interpreter of the dreams would be able to tell the difference between the crux of the message and the insignificant detail provided by Paro himself. Now, it seems that Paro's magicians all fell into the trap when they interpreted the dreams, and they based their interpretations upon the fact that the lean cows grew no fatter after consuming the healthy cows. Also, they suggested interpretations which ignored the image of the two cows standing side by side. So Paro knew at that point that their interpretation was not correct. When Yosef arrives to interpret the dreams, Paro repeats the description with the addition, and their appearance was as bad as it had been at first, and once again omits the detail of the two cows standing side by side. Yosef begins to interpret the dream, and it appears for a moment that he too is going to fall into this trap that the other magicians fell into. Okay, so he starts saying that the 7 years of famine will follow, the years of plenty, and all the years of plenty in the land of Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will consume the land, etc., and the bounty will not be known in the land because of the famine afterwards, because it will be most severe. Yosef too relates this false detail, and his interpretation is incorrect. But a second before Paro is about to haul him back into prison, Yosef calls out and continues and says, to everyone's surprise, he proposes an Egyptian reorganization of the whole national economy as a means of dealing with the years of famine. And in fact, the entire suggestion indicates that the 7 years of famine will not entirely consume the years of plenty of the previous 7 years. Or in the terminology of the dream, even after the 7 years of famine come and consume the 7 years of plenty, it will still be known that the years of plenty preceded them. The appearance of the 7 lean cows can indeed be changed. Okay, the years of plenty will be a surety for the years of famine. In other words, the years of plenty will have the power to save Egypt from the years of famine, in complete contrast to the false details applied by Paro. How did Yosef have the chutzpah, the audacity, to say such a thing? From the dream itself, but from the secret hidden detail only known to Paro and Yosef, who admits that it's not he himself who's interpreting the dream, but rather that God will put Paro's mind at rest. And this is the significance of the two cows standing side by side on the banks of the river. There will be a stage, Yosef informs Paro, where it will be possible to put the years of plenty next to or parallel to the years of famine, before the years of famine devour and consume the years of plenty. The food must be gathered and stored during the years of plenty and kept aside for the years of famine. Yosef's audacious suggestion is not a personally motivated one, as appears initially, as one could think, right? But rather a direct continuation of the interpretation itself of the dream. It's the interpretation of the detail that Paro forgot to mention. This suggestion hinted at in the original dream invalidates a false detail which Paro added of his own accord. And therefore Paro is amazed. And he says to his servants, "Is there such a man as this in whom the divine spirit rests?" And the rest, as they say, is history. Rabbi Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, said that Yosef had 3 gifts that only few people have in combination. First is that he dreamed dreams. As I mentioned before, only in this parasha do we realize that Yosef's dreams really were prescient. Secondly, Yosef could interpret the dreams of others. He interpreted the dreams of the butler and the baker in prison, and in this week's parasha, those of Paro. His interpretations were neither magical nor miraculous. In the case of the butler and the baker, he remembered that in 3 days' time it would be Paro's birthday, and it was customary in those days that the ruler would make a big birthday feast and also decide the fate of certain individuals. And therefore Yosef was working on the dreams, that the dreams of the butler and the baker would be part of their unconscious hopes and fears for the future, knowing that this day was coming of Paro's birthday. Yosef's most impressive achievement, however, was his third gift, the ability to implement dreams, solving the problem for which the dreams were an early warning. So we see here in this week's parasha, no sooner had he told of a 7-year famine that he sets out to provide a solution. We had already seen Yosef's brilliant administrative skills in Potiphar's house and in prison, and it is this gift demonstrated at precisely the right time that led to his appointment as Viceroy of Egypt. As Rabbi Sachs says, from Yosef we learn 3 principles. The first is dream dreams. Never let your imagination never be afraid to let your imagination soar. In dreams we discover our passion, and that leads to a rewarding life. Rabbi Sachs says, dreaming is one of the most practical things we can do. There are people who spend months planning a holiday, but not even a day planning a life. They let themselves be carried by the winds of change in circumstance. That is a mistake. The second principle we learn from Yosef is that leaders interpret other people's dreams. They find a way of expressing the hopes and fears of a generation. It was not Yosef's dreams that made him a leader, it was Paro's dreams that made him a leader. As Rabbi Sachs says, it is other people's dreams that give us opportunity. And the third principle we learn from Yosef is find a way to implement dreams. See the problem, then solve it. Good leaders, says Rabbi Sachs, good leaders or surround themselves with problem solvers. It is easy to see what's going wrong. Making someone a leader is the ability to find a way of putting it right. Rabbi Sachs concludes, dream dreams, understand and articulate the dreams of others, and find ways of turning a dream into a reality. These 3 gifts are leadership the Yosef way. In a world full of leaders in this day and age who have no moral compass and no backbone, I wish they'd learn the Parashat Miketz. Maybe they should be doing so. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.